Hi, everyone. Hi. Thank you for coming to the third and final installment of our forum on psychoanalysis and society. I'm really happy to see some of you who've come to all three. That's amazing. You get a prize for that. The first two events, which were about Erich Fromm and Berta Pappenheim, who's more commonly known as Freud's Anna O, happened over the last 2 weeks, and they will be posted soon on YouTube. And I also want to thank everyone who helped make this series happen, in particular David Brown and Michael Simonson. Yeah, I see a lot of familiar faces and new faces, so if you're new or if you forgot, I'll just tell you a little bit about LBI. We are an archive and research library dedicated to preserving German-speaking Jewish history. And we also host events like this, not only lectures, but also films, performances, we put up exhibitions, and I strongly encourage you after this event at the reception to go see our current exhibition, which is just out there off the Great Hall. It's the Art and Life of Samson Shamus, who was a German Jewish exile, and I'm biased, but there are really beautiful paintings and mosaics and some very interesting reading, so I recommend it. Tonight, we're really excited to host this discussion on Charlotte Beradt's The Third Reich of Dreams, which is a groundbreaking collection of dreams that's very timely of witnesses of the rise of Nazism, which provided valuable insight into the effects of authoritarianism on the unconscious mind. And we were really lucky tonight to have Amanda Rubin speaking in conversation with Gal Beckerman. Amanda Rubin is a documentary filmmaker, journalist, and independent scholar. She has made documentaries for the BBC, Channel 4, Sky TV, and the History Channel, amongst others. And it's really interesting. She came across the lost rights to the Third Reich of Dreams while researching a film about Charlotte Beradt, which we'll be excited to hear more about tonight. And Amanda put her energies towards getting the text republished this year, to much acclaim. The film is a biographical drama inspired by Beradt's life, and yeah, should be very interesting. And joining her in conversation is Gal Beckerman, who is an author and the senior books editor at The Atlantic. He has also held editorial positions at The New York Times, Book Review, The Forward, and the Columbia Journalism Review. And his writing has appeared in a number of other publications, including The Washington Post, The New Republic, and Book Forum. He is the author of The Quiet Before, on the unexpected origins of the radical idea, which was a New York Times notable book, and When They Came for Us Will Be Gone. When They Come for Us Will Be Gone. The Epic Struggle to Save Soviet Jewry, which won the National Jewish Book Award. After the talk, we'll have a short Q&A, followed by a reception where the book will be available for sale. And now I'll invite up Amanda and Gal to start the conversation.
Hello. It's nice to see such a full room. People like psychoanalysis, I guess. Although this is not really about psychoanalysis at all. This book is fascinating. It is a book of dreams, and normally it would be sort of insufferable to listen to other people's dreams. But these are absolutely fascinating, and I feel very grateful that Amanda resurrected this book, because I know for me, personally, it landed at a bracing moment in American history, which was earlier this year, when the second Trump administration started. And regardless of your political viewpoint, we were sure that we had ahead of us a kind of a tumultuous political environment. And I know that I was thinking a lot about how that trickles down internally into how we feel every day, into how we think, into our mental states. And this is a book about another tumultuous moment, not to compare, but the 1930s Germany, and how how it also trickled down into people's deepest senses of self, and that's what we see in these dreams. So I have a lot of questions, but I really want to start with Charlotte, and I want you to give us a little bit a sense of who she is. Before we get into the dreams, before we get into the substance, I think it's important to set her up as a person.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? If I lapse, just please shout from the back, because I sometimes drift off. Thank you for the introduction. So when I think about Charlotte, whose life I've sort of slightly been inhabiting for the last 5 years as I've researched the film I'm making, I'm even wearing her ring, which I brought for you, and I'll tell you the story of how it came to be. But when I think about her, the words that come to mind are daring, resilient, charming, curious, glamorous, and smart, and adaptive. Like she was a survivor, really. She adapted. She came of age. She was born in 1901 in Berlin, and she came of age in the 20s. And got swept in the kind of wave of kind of utopian socialism. She was a communist, so she was an early member of the Communist Party and one of the last of the communists in Germany. And she talks about being sort of swept up in this wave of utopianism. She became, although she wasn't formally, she was educated, she came from a quite wealthy merchant family, although I know very little about her background, really. Which will be interesting when we come to the psychoanalysis bit, but she didn't go to university, but she was very cultured and kind of, she educated herself and very literary, and she moved in these literary circles in Germany. And she became a journalist, and she wrote about social issues. She wrote about women's issues. She was quite a proto-feminist, if you like. And she sort of rode this wave of glamour. She was a model. And she translated Charlie Chaplin's Hello, Europe. So there was all this kind of excitement and hope and optimism, I think, in the 20s that she was carried along on. And then in the 30s, when Hitler came to power, all those sort of futures were extinguished. She was arrested as a suspect in the Reichstag fire. Her first husband, was also arrested. She managed to charm him out, get him out. And she charmed her, she only spent a night, but she charmed herself out too. And she began to have these dreams. Banned from working as a journalist, she started to ask people about their dreams. She saw this potentially as kind of evidence against the regime. This was early, this was 33. And between 33 and 39, she collected something like 300 dreams. She asked people that she could safely ask. She wrote them in code, and she hid them in the spines of books in her library, and she sent them out of Germany as letters to friends abroad. And she left in 39, she got to New York, and she didn't pick the dreams up. She wrote something in 43, but for 30 years they sort of remained, I don't know, I'm going to say under her bed. I don't know where they were, but she didn't look at them. She set up a hair salon. Can I keep going on her biography?
Let's stop that. We'll get there. Okay. So it started with her own dream.
Started with her own
Okay,
dream.
I didn't realize that. So she realized at some point that her subconscious was being affected at some level by what was happening outside.
Yeah, exactly that. Yeah, I think she had this sense that that something was being changed in her, and that she couldn't be the only one who was experiencing the kind of distorting landscape, and so she asked other people.
And tell me about, what was her milieu? Like, what was her world? where was she living? Who are the people? Because she's interviewing neighbors and friends. At one point, it's like the milkman or something, right? So where does she sort of sit in German society in 1933?
In 1933, she's moved in with a man who's to become her second husband, called Martin Beradt, who was a notable author and I don't know if he was a judge or a lawyer, but he defended Rathenau in the early 20s, and he was a prolific writer and published. And she moved in these quite high-level intellectual writer, artist, poets circles, and but she, as a journalist, I think her curiosity was that what she wanted to do was have as wide a cross-section of German society. So these were Jewish and non-Jewish dreams. They were dreams of everybody from lawyers and doctors to milkmaids and chimney sweeps and construction workers. So it's the whole cross-section.
But there's no dreams in there of people who are excited about the Nazis.
No.
It's all. So I mean, that would have been interesting. Would have been different kinds of dreams, but these are mostly. I got the sense just through the dreams that we're talking about a kind of an upper middle class, like liberal world.
I don't think they were all. There are
well, you're right. She
some
does
of those.
because it's the people who she's coming across also.
I don't think they were all. They were sort of secretaries. They worked in shops. They were a pipe fitter. You know, it's a whole section. But yeah, I think probably the closer people to her were more. But she could only safely. I mean, she was already on the watch list from the Nazis. Yeah, and she was in the resistance, and so safely she couldn't ask people who were already overtly in support of the Nazis for their dreams. Anything would have been subversive. And similarly, that's why she wrote them in code.
Right. Well, the code is kind of amazing. So you have to explain what the Uncle Hans and the virus. But yeah. So explain that, but also maybe more broadly, like what we know about her methodology. Like how did she go about this? And also, I'm curious, like, at what point it became a project for her? Because one can imagine, like, oh, I had a strange dream, and then you start asking everybody you know, and they tell you their dreams. But at some point, she really took this on as a project, and the code is, in a way, like, indicative of the seriousness with which she was sort of taking this on, right?
I think on two levels, that's true. One is that, I mean, being in the resistance meant, and the real fear and the real danger that they were facing, and that's evidenced in some of her letters. Her archive is at Marbach in Germany at the Deutsche Literature Archive, and there's about 14 boxes of her papers and letters. The dreams, unfortunately, are not there, but there's manuscripts of them typed up. So I don't know what she did with them, but so, yeah, that there are letters which sort of show, I think, the fear, I mean, quite extraordinary fear. She writes to her first husband, who's by then gone to Czechoslovakia, about that sort of, just how much danger they were in as people in the resistance, and communists, and against the regime. So, I've forgotten your question. She... her methodology was to gather dreams. She says a doctor helped her, a doctor who could more easily ask people about their dreams, was gathering for these dreams for her as well. And she says that people were kind of reluctant even to share their dreams. And so she might start by saying, oh, you know, a man told me about a dream he had, and then that would then elicit a response from someone. They might say, oh yeah, I had a funny dream, or, you know, so that's how she gathered those.
I thought the code was because she transferred every one of these dreams into code.
Yeah.
So Hitler was Uncle Hans, the party was the family, and an arrest was the flu, right? So this sounded like some bizarre, very sick family with a strange uncle, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And then she hid it in the bindings of her own books. What do we know about how, you mentioned this briefly, but what do we know about how she sort of got it out of Germany?
Yeah, so she says that she wrote that she sort of sent them as letters to friends abroad. And she says, you know, these strange sounding family anecdotes. You know, well, I was just going to mention that the foreword to the book by Dunya Mikhail, which I know we'll get to, but she talks about, she's an Iraqi American poet, and she had to leave Iraq in the 90s as a opposer of Saddam Hussein. And she said when she was writing, and when people were writing to her, she would say, you know, how are the flowers? And people would say, they're wilting, that you couldn't be avert. So I think that's how she wrote these, how she sent them.
And so, what year does she? I know I'm backtracking on the biography, but I think it's important before we get to the dreams. So she gets to America in
1940.
1940, she sets up in New York. She becomes friends with Hannah Arendt. She does Marc Chagall's wife's hair, right? Who else's hair does she do? Is anybody else
She
famous?
does. Well, the people. She said I did the hair of everyone from the sort of German intellectual writers and poets' wives to the wives of cattle dealers. So the sort of whole range. But Elizabeth Bergner, who was a famous actress, Gerda Meyerhoff, who was a photographer, who was Roman Vishniak's assistant, who'd gone collecting, you know, a very eminent photographer who was the last to document Eastern Europe before the end of it. That's mainly it. Chagall's wife, and there's some anecdote about Chagall having to agree to a certain color of pink, which I thought was quite wild.
Bella, right? Isn't that his wife's name?
Bella,
yeah.
She was
And so, do you have a theory for why it took 30 years for her, 30 years, right, for her to turn this into a book? And then, how did that come about?
So, a couple of things. I mean, when they arrived in New York, so by then she's married to a second husband. So, first husband has gone to Czechoslovakia. I can't really quite work out why that marriage dissolved. But she marries Martin Beradt, with whom she's been living for a few years, partly possibly to get out of the country in 1938. That was, you know, expedient. But they cared for each other, and she cared for him. They arrive in New York. They're carrying very little, but Kafka's first edition of The Penal Colony, which they sell for $3. And they've got no money. All their furniture is shipped from Berlin, which arrives a year or two later, but they get a small apartment in a boarding house in the Upper West Side. And she just has to set to work making money and supporting them. He couldn't. He was going blind. And so she sets up the salon. And so for, 40 to 60 and but later, for 20 plus years, she's dyeing hair, and that's what's keeping her going. In the late 50s, maybe the early 60s, she's constantly trying to get, he dies in 49, but she's constantly trying to get his last novel published, and nobody's interested. And in the exchanges with publishers, she mentions that she's got these dreams. And Carl Otten, who was putting together an anthology of expressionist writers and poets and people whose whole sort of oeuvre had been, you know, just ignored really because of the war, says, that sounds interesting, why don't you write them up? And so that's how
do we know how it was received at the time?
She published it, so first of all, a radio broadcast in the early 60s for West German radio is a sort of dramatization stroke essay is broadcast, and then that catalyzes the sort of book. I think it's sort of, there was a ripple, but it was just the beginning of Germany beginning to open up and think about and explore its own kind of damaged psyche. And so it wasn't like it wasn't massively received, but it did go into second print. So the first edition was 66, then in English in 68, and then in 72, a second edition of it. So I guess it's old. And it's been in print ever since in German.
Okay, so let's talk about the dreams.
Yeah.
We've been talking around them, but I think this is what's so fascinating. And actually, the book is mostly the dreams, right? I mean, she sort of comes in here and there, and she has some very sort of smart, interesting sort of analysis, but she really sort of just lets you read the dreams. So I'm curious to have you kind of categorize a bit sort of how you understand the various kinds of dreams that we're reading in here. But maybe before we do that, I wondered if you had like a favorite dream that you wanted to read, just to give people a taste of what these are like.
I mean, I often wonder, I think people will probably, different dreams will resonate with different people. You know, there might be dreams that resonate with you, and I think that's a lot about, I don't know, just what's in our own psyches. This one really sort of struck me. And I'm not sure why, but it really, I mean, they're all really powerful, and they're all quite visual, and they have themes and motifs that characterize them and patterns that you see. So here's one. It's from a woman who she just describes them as, she'll just say a 45-year-old or a 33-year-old woman. She calls this woman liberal and somewhat pampered, middle-class woman. She says, so this is her dream. I was sitting in a box at the opera, beautifully dressed, my hair done, wearing a new dress. The opera house was huge with many, many tears, and I was enjoying many admiring glances. They were performing my favorite opera, The Magic Flute. After the line, "That is the devil, certainly," a squad of policemen marched in and headed straight toward me, their footsteps ringing out loud and clear. They had discovered by using some kind of machine that I had thought about Hitler when I heard the word devil. I looked around at all the dressed-up people in the audience, pleading for help with my eyes, but they all just stared straight ahead, mute and expressionless, with not a single face showing even pity. Actually, the older gentleman in the box next to mine looked kind and elegant, but when I tried to catch his eye, he spat at me.
Wow. I mean, it's interesting to sort of pick up the patterns, actually. A lot of them are about sort of a loss of privacy, right? There's all these dreams where like the furniture starts listening in on conversations, or the furniture starts talking and revealing secrets, right?
Yeah, like sort of household
or the
objects.
walls suddenly like fall, and then you're exposed.
Yeah.
What were some of the? I'm curious, like kind of what were some of the interesting patterns that you noticed there?
A couple of things. We were talking earlier about Hannah Arendt, who she became friends with, who she shared lots of things with, including Arendt's husband. But she looked after Arendt's affairs, and she translated for Arendt. In the Origins of Totalitarianism, Arendt talks about, I was able to understand it with these sort of distillation of three things that happen under totalitarianism. So one is about the effacing of the boundary between the private and the public. So the self gets lost in that, the individual gets lost in that, and that comes through in these dreams when, yes, the walls disappear in an apartment. A man spends 30 minutes trying to raise his arm in a Nazi salute, and then his spine breaks.
That one is chilling.
Yeah, it's really chilling.
Yeah.
The dream of the raised arm. Furniture begins to talk at people. They realize that they've been listened to, that everything they've said to each other in the privacy of their home, what they thought they were safe, actually they weren't, because it's been recorded. So there are these themes of surveillance, of the fear of surveillance. There are themes of, there's so many themes. But yeah, the loss of self, the loss of the individual.
It's interesting that this is 1933, right? So it's just, the Nazis have just taken power, and already there's these feelings have seeped into people's deepest subconscious.
Yeah. She talks about how the dream, so she collected these dreams between 33 and 39 when she left, so just over 6 years. And she says that in a way, the early dreams are not that different to the later dreams, that somehow people's anticipation, the fear, the power of the imagination to sort of imagine the worst in their dreams was there, even when, as she describes it, the regime was sort of treading lightly still. The sort of terror.
And Hitler shows up in a lot of them in sort of like strange ways.
Yeah.
The way you can imagine if there's a figure who's so dominating the public sphere that, like, there's the one with him in like lion tamer outfit with the purple pants and the like.
Clowns. Sort
like
of
he's half a clown, half a lion tamer or something.
Yeah,
like there's
exactly. And there's a lot of dreams. There's a whole sort of section about, she calls them erotic dreams, but they're really dreams where women, who we know were very adoring of Hitler, and they managed to play on that quite, consciously. Goebbels, they knew to play on that. But the dreams of women that they're being seduced by Hitler, dancing with Hitler, being stroked by Hitler, that desire to belong, is to be approved of, to be accepted, is so strong amongst all the people, that the desire for belonging is very, very strong, and for approval.
There's two sort of subsets of dreams that I find really interesting. I know that you do too, which is there's the dreams of resistance, which are like action movies, right? I think she even calls it that a little bit. And then there's really fascinating is the dreams of conformity, or fantasies of conformity, in which people are just kind of like, in their dreams they're sort of putting up a fight, and then in the dream they're saying like, it's so nice not to have to. It's so nice not to have to say no. It's so nice not to have to fight anymore. And suddenly, like, they look down and they're wearing the Nazi uniform, or they look down and they're saluting. I wonder how you sort of understand those dreams. And I guess the thing they make me think about is sort of what does this reveal about how people respond in authoritarian situations? And are those responses somehow like already in us? And so like the people with the dreams of resistance are like naturally inclined to resist, and the people with the dreams of conformity are naturally inclined to conform? Or is it something about the environment that sort of brings out that response in us?
I think the bigger answer to that is probably people very well placed to answer that, the kind of deep psychology of that.
It's not a small question, but from somebody who's...
Exactly. But what I was going to say was that those dreams of conformity are really at the essence of this project, because I think what the book reveals is the extent to which our capacity as humans, the regime was literally sort of invading the unconscious. It was what's the word I've got for it? It was an invasion. She says, if they'd wanted to, the dreams they were dictated by the dictatorship. It was like an internal takeover, and so the conformity. So the dreams are often about that huge dilemma about how you hold the outside at bay, the propaganda and the lies and the terror and the physical violence and the psychological terror that were all, part of a kind of everyday exterior, and how they became internalized and took over the internal landscape. We're strong as humans, but we we have sort of breaking points, don't we? She says people's, there are some dreams where people say, it goes from sort of, I dreamt only of circles, triangles, and squares. You see, it was forbidden to dream, to I dreamt I didn't have to say no anymore. And she says, what does she say? Freedom is a burden, unfreedom is a relief. So to actually just say, I can't resist it anymore. I'm just going to follow the crowd. I'm going to sing it with a chorus. I'm going to, get in step with the marching soldiers. All that sort of stuff is kind of really played out quite interestingly in the dream.
Yeah, no, I mean, I found those dreams to be the most fascinating because the anxiety dreams felt kind of more, I don't want to say obvious, but like, but if you're living in a moment of tumult, of uncertainty, like it's clear that that's the way that it's going to play out. But the interesting twist in a lot of those dreams of conformity is, like I was saying earlier, like the person within the dream sort of is like struggling, so there's, one I remember, there's like a woman who's on a train and there's people singing political songs and she's annoyed in the dream. Since she's moving from table to table, and then in the dream she thinks to herself, maybe if you sing it's not so silly anymore.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And suddenly she's singing along, or or there's a person who is like admonishing their friends for doing Hitler salutes, and they kick her out of their house, and she gets on the train, and everyone's looking at her, and then she does a Hitler salute. So it's like that this struggle that you're describing actually is taking place internally.
Yeah, and I think it's taking place partly because what's described is the way in which human bonds get broken. And so in that dream, for instance, she's visiting a friend, and suddenly it goes from friendly to suddenly the friend turns on her and sort of banishes her, and that's why she ends up, and there's a dream of a young woman who's half Jewish, and her Jewish mother, she's carrying her Jewish mother. They're fleeing. She's carrying her mother. And after a while, the burden is really heavy, and she puts her down, and she realizes her mother's dead. And she feels this sense of relief that she doesn't have to carry this deep kind of, this burden of her Jewishness, of her half-Jewishness. So that way in which human, trust, initially you can't trust people, you can't even trust in your own home anybody, and then can you trust yourself even anymore? So that
it's a very Arendtian sort of idea that's how totalitarianism sort of seeps in, right? That people become alienated from one another, that atomized in that
exactly.
sort of way,
isolated.
So this series is called Psychoanalysis, but I was joking earlier that she's very consciously pushing against Freudian analysis of dreams, right? And I'm curious sort of how you. It's funny, I was looking back because I wrote a piece about this book, and I was trying to like distinguish in the piece like how Freud would see something in the straightforward way she would, a more straightforward, it seems to me, way that she would understand. So if I think I wrote, if you dreamed in 1933 that Hitler was sort of caressing your shoulders and you went to an analyst, they would want to talk about your father, right? And like what that says about your relationship with your father, right? But she would say, no, this has something to do with the way the sort of political atmosphere was dominating and sort of like crowding in on you. And she says that the dreams were kind of seismographs, right? That was like a wonderful line, that they track sort of what's happening politically as opposed to what's happening personally, which would be the kind of Freudian way of understanding some of these dreams. So, but I'm curious, like, for just more background on where is she coming from in her pushing back against Freud, and you can say better, more than what I said about sort of what distinguishes her approach to dreams.
Well, again, I'll probably go out to the audience. So in the Q&A, people might be slightly better placed. Obviously, psychoanalysis is such a huge and varied, discipline. But she was very pragmatic, a lot like Arendt, I think. She didn't have any truck for psychoanalysis. In fact, she quotes Karl Jaspers, who was Arendt's friend and I think maybe teacher, who's called it, she says, the existential nonsense of dream interpretation. And I mean, I sometimes wonder whether it was partly, she was very private. She didn't really talk about her own background, her own family background, and although Arendt did, obviously there's lots about it, but somehow she left that behind, and so maybe just psychoanalysis didn't fit. They'd also come through a lot. I wonder whether there was just no time or energy to kind of dwell too much on the past. It was sort of, in terms of that kind of internal kind of world. But more than that, I think you're right. I mean, she calls these snapshots and sketches, she says it's like a mosaic. They're like little individual tesserae, which kind of make up this kind of picture of Germany minus the Nazi dreams, which would have been interesting. But the rest of the population and how it was sort of distorting and deforming and slowly adapting to Nazism. And so I'm just looking, she talks about the dreams are all but waking dreams. They're part of the way the imagination tries to, she says, sort of express the inexpressible, how it tries to make sense of the world, but it doesn't matter what kind of relationships particularly people had, because the present was the present needed dealing with so much, and this was a way to try and process what was happening, and a sort of almost in a survival kind of mechanism. She also talks about, and she quotes, quotes George Grosz, the painter, who says somebody, I can't remember the quote, but told me I needed to leave Germany, and I listened to them and I left. And Paul Tillich, the theologian and philosopher, says, in our wake up, I dreamt almost every night of the mechanisms of control of the Nazis, and in my waking life, I thought we could resist, but my dreams knew better, or the unconscious knew better. So I think she does recognize the unconscious and Freudian terms, but she doesn't. It's not about the personal; it's about the political and about the exterior world.
I mean, it is so interesting because, like, when you strip, it's kind of impossible to strip away the personal completely, and it accounts for some of the differences we're seeing of whether you have that dream of conformity or you have a dream of resistance, or you're just anxious in a very particular way, or you're dreaming about your mother on your back. Like, so was she, because I imagine, like, if in the 60s when this book is coming out, if you're talking about dreams and interpreting dreams, I mean, like, Freud is so dominant, right? I mean, that's still immediately what would come to mind. So I wonder, what did it mean for her to sort of push back against that? Were there other people who were already kind of like having a backlash against psychoanalysis in a kind of a Freudian way?
I don't know the answer to that. I'm not sure. I mean, Bruno Bettelheim wrote the afterword to the first English edition in 1968, and I was talking to someone yesterday who's here in the audience about, she was saying to me that he was trying to sort of retrofit psychoanalysis onto this, and it doesn't quite work. What he talks about is how dreams in a kind of Freudian model would be, sorry, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sure lots of people in the audience might understand this differently, but your dream life is often a place where you can learn to mold yourself in a way that fits with the world. So, you could dream, you could be bullied by someone, but in your dream you kind of get some superhuman strength, or you're worried about exams, you play it through, but then you kind of know I succumb. You kind of get courage, and you get a sense of I'm really doing a bad job, I know, for all you Freudians out here, but there's an absence of that in these dreams, except for the resistance dreams. There is an absence of people getting a strong sense of self and the ability to resist. And so I think the Freudian model perhaps doesn't fit particularly, because these dreams need to be interpreted at the level at which she interprets them, and that.
But there is I would be curious to hear from the Freudians, because I don't know any that much better either. But if you're having a fantasy of conformity in your dream, what I understand, about the way a Freudian would analyze that dream is that you're living out that fantasy within the dream, maybe because you're strong enough to resist it, or it gives you some kind of ability to then resist in waking life. That you're somehow like dealing with that feeling, if you subconsciously.
Dream that. And I mean, there are resistance dreams. She says that the people who had the sort of most powerful kind of moral certainty also had positive and positive dreams of resistance. They were able to resist in their dreams as they were in their.
There was a sort of a one-to-one.
But there's just one chapter of those, and there's 11
right,
chapters.
of the rest. Yeah. Have people been telling you about their dreams as you walk around the world with this book?
Well, did I just say that?
We just talked about it.
You told me
I told you about my dream,
and then I said, "Wow!" In the last 24 hours, I've spoken to 3 people that have told me their dreams, and they're like I could be recording these dreams, and I could be being Charlotte, and about how you're experiencing this current political landscape,
Are there any? You only have a sample size of 2 or 3, but anything that sort of strikes you as being similar to the dreams that you read in?
Yeah. I mean, somebody told today, I don't know if he's here, told me a dream about papers and getting his papers in order and trying to find identity papers and trying to kind of organize, and this is a recurring dream of organizing his papers in case he's called upon to present himself to the authorities and justify his existence here. And another person told me about a dream of trying to think of the tenet of it. But yeah, the symbolism is very clear in it. It's very strong. It's very clear.
It feels much more like her approach could apply, whereas you see 100%. The political sort of right on the surface. Yeah,
absolutely.
Tell me about your own coming to her and to this project.
I read an article in the New Yorker called "How Dreams Change Under Authoritarianism" by an Australian, you know her, Mireille Jichao, so we can all thank her, because actually she found a 1985 copy of the book, the second edition in English, in a sort of dusty Melbourne University shelf, and she pulled it out, and she did some research in Berlin, and she wrote this New Yorker article, and it was sent to me by somebody a few years later, because I was beginning to try and make a documentary about dreams, totally different. But I read the article, and something about, we were in lockdown, President Trump was towards the end of his first term, China was denying lab leaks. The world was sort of felt like it was tilting on the dystopian axis, and the book sort of spoke to me in a kind of, there was a sort of prescience about it. And so I began to research her story, and as I did so, I sort of reached out to find people who'd known her, and I was introduced to someone who lived just a few streets away from me in London. In London.
Oh, in London.
I live in London, yeah. And he had published it in 1985, and he said, "Yeah, I was given the rights by her, but I don't know where they are. The English rights had been lost. Nobody knew where they were. And so, but he said, I think I've lost them.
And she didn't have children? No.
She had no children. Yeah, she had no children. And I traced everybody who knew her. And there was just a few people still living. But he's called Robin Shohet. He published it in 1985. And he was writing a book about dream sharing, and he'd come across it. Anyway, he gave me the rights. He said, I asked him, I said, please look for them, because maybe you've just filed them or hidden them or something. Can't have thrown them away. Surely you haven't thrown them away. And then I don't know about publishing, but that's what I figured. You don't throw away rights. And then he turned up for a coffee with me, and he said, I found the rights, and he gave them to me. And he said, I'm not going to do anything with them. You publish them. So, hence. And I've continued developing the documentary, and I've got a radio documentary I'm making for the BBC in January, and the book was published by Princeton.
Why do you think you're so interested in her?
I know. I don't know. I've sort of begun to live her a bit. There's just lots of elements about her that I just really love. I love her story, this sort of arc of, being this woman in Weimar, Germany, kind of doing stuff, just being a kind of a new voice, really, I suppose, when sort of women were liberated. And then this sort of dark period of 40 years, and then she finds her voice again in her 60s, and she becomes a cultural commentator for West German radio, and I just love that she found her voice again. I feel that women's voices and stories need to be told, and this feels like a powerful one. Those women, Arendt had a strong voice, and she was able to. But there's something really appealing and untold about this, and so I've been drawn to it.
So I think what we're going to do is going to watch a few minutes of I don't know if you want to set it up, the what we're going to see.
Sure.
And then we're gonna do that, and then we're gonna just a few minutes, and then we're gonna come back and do some questions.
So this is a 3-minute sort of teaser tape. This is what I'm taking round while I'm trying to raise money for the film, and it's drawn from other people's films. So it's kind of don't really have permission to use all these clips, but I've put them together because it's a sort of taster and it's a kind of internal document, if you like, So don't tell anyone. But the idea is that it's for, it gives you a sense of the sort of tone and the texture of the film that we're making. But I'm sure there'll be questions.
Okay.
I recognize those clips from Babylon Berlin, for which I am the blogger for mhcchoice.com. My question is, the dreams seem to be primarily in black and white, but they have a nightmarish feel that is very similar to Weimar cinema, especially to the invention of the horror genre. Well, what is your reaction to what you've read about her dreams and everything? Do you see a connection between that particular film genre and her dreams?
Thank you. Yes, that's our intention really, is to kind of invoke the cinema of the period and the photography of the period, surrealism, expressionist cinema, the kind of themes that were coming through at that period, which was, very creative and distinctive, is, how we're kind of pitching the film, and that's I'm glad it's come through like that. But I was at MoMA yesterday in the surrealist room, and it was great to just be with some of those films and paintings of that era. The surrealists use dreams a lot, so the films of Buñuel and they'll definitely that will inform it quite significantly. Thank you.
I'm happy to say that I've had no dreams about Uncle Donald. But I do want to say that in terms of a thought about the conformity dreams, and that conformity in this instance of living through a trauma and our nervous system's response to trauma, that the conformity dream could be a way to achieve safety. That the danger, it doesn't necessarily mean that the person is conforming, but that the person, through their dreams, the conforming is a form of finding safety in this oppressive environment. The other thing is that everyone who, we don't know very much about the people who had these dreams, but everybody brings something of their histories. So we don't know about the re-traumatization for these individuals in terms of their own histories and what they're experiencing in this environment where they're losing agency, where they're losing their privacy, where they're being invaded in a sense. So I wish that we had more history on the people whose dreams we're hearing.
I mean, I think if she was a psychoanalyst recording dreams, that would have been her. She would have stressed that. She would have unpacked it differently. She wasn't. So I think she brought that other kind of perspective, more sort of journalistic or social scientific kind of attempt to understand how a country and its populace gets turned, that sort of that sort of idea of anticipatory and obedience. There's the idea of something she calls Gleichschaltung, the synchronizing of the way in which the kind of machine of totalitarianism acted on its citizens, and how people conform. So I think that's the lens that she brings to it. But absolutely, there will definitely be ways in which, as individuals, there would have been different facets of their personality would have been coming through, but we just don't know.
Hi, first of all, I'm going to wish you lots of luck on the book and the documentary.
Thank you.
And mine is not as involved as all that, but tell us the story about the ring.
Oh, yeah, the ring. Well, really briefly, I was in San Francisco last summer. I had got a residency at the Jewish Film Institute for the year, which is a fabulous film residency. And I just got there, and I had a discussion with somebody and involved with the film, and it hadn't gone well, and I was feeling really a bit like, oh, God, I don't know if I got any energy for this film anymore, it's so much work. So, making films are hard, trying to raise the money and persuade people that. So anyway, I was like, maybe I'm done. And I went to sleep that night, and I looked up at the rafters, and I said, Charlotte, if you're up there, give me a sign. Give me a sign that I should carry on with this. It's your story, I'm telling it. And I woke up, and the first thing that happened was that my colleague in London called saying, oh, we got the documentary, the BBC, the radio documentary, that's been commissioned. I was like, great. Sort of felt like a sign. But then I drove down to Stamford, where I got in a cab, went down to Stamford to meet some friends of Charlotte, a few living friends. They're pretty old now, called the Kaspars. He was head of Chicago Law School and president of Stanford, and Regina is a professor emeritus of psychiatry, and we had lunch. It was the first time I'd met them. They'd been supporting me a lot with the film and information and stuff, but it was the first time face to face. And as I was about to leave, she said, I want to show you something. And I said, okay. And I was waiting. I said, send me a picture, can't find it. She couldn't find it. And eventually she found it, and she said, here, this is her ring. I want you to have it. And she'll want you to have it. And I got in the cab, and I was going back to San Francisco. I was like, wow, I think that's a sign. so I put it on Facebook to my friends, and I was like, was that a sign? And they were like, yeah, it's a sign.
That's a sign.
Keep going. So that's why I bring it. So she's here in spirit.
I had a strange question, as you said that, about aftermath, because a lot of these people would have been in New York, presumably in the community, and the trauma doesn't die as you are displaced or the diaspora. And I'm just curious, because she stays in perhaps that world, if there was any curiosity, any desire on her part to continue the project amongst that community.
I don't know, really. Their world was definitely, she was part of this small group of emigre, intellectual, sort of artist emigres. They were very close. They were called Das Dorf. They called themselves Das Dorf, the village, and Hannah Arendt was part of that. She, I'm not sure she went back to the dreams until later. She, I think, that's a bit that I sort of feel sad about, but that she seemed always to be enabling other people. So her main focus through the 40s and 50s was trying to get her husband's novel published. And it was in that process that this came about. So she didn't sort of put herself forward, and I don't know if that's just was a female thing or just she didn't value her own intellectual prowess in the way that, say, Arendt did hers, I think she was a bit in Arendt's shadow, maybe. I don't know that, she didn't carry on with the project. I think it was only when she sat down to try and make sense of the dreams, and I think she said it was much harder than she had imagined, to find a kind of thesis through it that maybe it began to make actual sense, that sort of she used them as a sort of framework to kind of understand what had happened to them and how they had all sort of lived how those years had been lived. And the dreamers, we don't know what happened to a lot of them.
Were they written in German or were they written in English?
Oh, I mean, they would have been recorded in German, definitely. And I don't really know.
It makes a difference in how you understand what the dream means. That's
absolutely, absolutely.
So when you read the English dream, you're missing who knows how much, a lot.
Yeah, so a couple of things. There are some attempts to explain how, because there's kind of quite a lot of wordplay as well. And so there's sort of, so there's one dream which is like, my tongue turns to lead, I am all lead. And she says, there's no pun on the word lead because in German, but there is in English, obviously. So she's always looking for these associations, word associations, and ways in which sometimes people have word associations and recognize it in their own dreams. So, for instance, a woman dreams, she dreams that she speaks in Russian, which is a language she doesn't actually speak. And she dreams in Russian so that she doesn't understand herself. It's quite a tongue twister. But the idea is that she's having thoughts which even she can't understand, and maybe the authorities can't understand them. So there are all these plays which she gets into, kind of puzzles. And the translation it's been retranslated. Princeton was one of the reasons I went with Princeton, as they wanted to retranslate it. And in fact, I just learned today that it's been shortlisted for a translation prize for the Jewish Literary something in London, Jewish Literary Review or something like that. So translation, and it makes a difference. I think that it's been retranslated, and I guess one has to rely on the translator.
Damien Searles is maybe one of the best German translators.
He did the ink blot, didn't he? Yeah.
I agree with you, Joan. I had my own, just like association. Is that Hitler, which we came here to see the horrible that whatever happened. But I was thinking about, is Hitler for everyone? Is Hitler? I was just thinking, what was her relationship with her father? Because Hitler is horrible, we all know, but also she is very resisting about Freud. And the Freud is also certain maybe dogmatic kind of way of thinking about women, especially, and she's a feminist. So it's two things. It's almost I watch and I hear the dream, maybe similar to Freud and Hitler. And then father came to my mind. So what is the relationship with her father created these dreams? And also her, definitively she resisting to understand in Freudian way of her unconscious. So I have many thoughts.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, it is interesting that you bring it up. I'm intrigued by her relationship with her father because there's no mention of him at all. I don't know what happens to him. There's a little mention about her mother, who supposedly, she doesn't say this, but I found it somewhere else, who committed suicide a little after they left in 1939. She stayed in Germany. So there's a very small little fragment, but I couldn't find nothing about her father. I haven't properly, I don't know when he died, if he died before the war. But yeah, there's no reference, but yet she lived this quite very comfortable life. There's photographs of her and skiing and being quite a sort of girl about town. So there was obviously money there. Partly she earned it. So yeah, that's an interesting thing, but I don't know how it might inform her relationship to Hitler or to Freud. But there's definitely something about her father.
I think we might have time for one more? Yeah, over here.
It's wonderful to see the visual effect of the movie. That there is a tall building, looks like a downtown Wall Street, and then there are, so many people, running around. It's not only for the Jewish people, it's also for the people under the capitalism. We are making very small money to pay off for the rent and surviving. So how did you take that picture, like from the at top of the tower, looking down the people, or I just technically interested?
Yeah, it is for all of the people. It's one of the points, and one of the things that attracted me to the project was that these are not just Jewish dreams, these are dreams of all the people, and I think that's that whole nature of othering and of racial hierarchies and the whole way in which this gets played out in different regimes, and that's important to be able. She talks about it as a lesson and a warning that it can happen to anywhere, I think, and we all as humans have to be alive to this possibility. Your question about, I mean, those are a kind of animation. They sort of drawn from a sort of probably scaled CGI computer, graphical animation, and I don't know the extent to which that kind of thing will appear, but certainly the idea of perspective and shifting perspectives will, that is a feature of German expressionist cinema, and I really like that, and photography, so that will definitely get recycled into our film.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. Glad we were able to have this conversation.